how much time do we actually waste queuing up? To find out, we need to find what percentage of time playing a game is actually spent in a loading queue. It's easy enough, as we'll just add up the time we were waiting in a queue and divide it by our overall playtime. Simple, yeah, but it only gives us a percentage for one game. So to get a more widespread, accurate percentage, we'll play 8 popular online games for roughly 2 hours each while timing how long each loading queue takes. From there, we'll add each game's times together and divide them by our total playing time for the final answer of how much time we waste queuing up. Still with me? Here, John, just look at this. I'm sure you're curious about which game queues were the worst, so I ranked them from shortest waiting times at number 8 to the longest at number 1. And yeah, John, I know what you're thinking. Well, actually, I'm a grand champ and I have to wait about 2 hours before I can get into a game. And to that, I say, shut up. But you're right. Each queue is so situational and dependent on your specific rank, game, time of day, location, and a million other factors. So I'll at least show you the equation in action for my times, so that you can figure out what percentage of your time is spent actually playing your games. Now finally, lock in your guesses for which games you think will have the longest queue times, and let's get into it.
Let's go!
Why did you do Counter-Strike and not Call of Duty? Shut up. I'm not paying $70 to a company that bans its players due to its own incompetence. So if you're anything like me, you suck at competitive Counter-Strike. I've tried this game off and on for years and have never gotten good. That said, it does mean I get very low queue times. I was actually super shocked to see that only 7 minutes and 42 seconds of my time playing CS was spent in a waiting queue. If we were to take 7 minutes and 42 seconds and divide that by roughly 2 hours and 2 minutes, we get roughly 6.3%. Only 6.3% of my time in CS was spent in a loading queue. I think because matches are so long, your loading queue times don't impact the final game as much. And yes, I am counting the time you spend in waiting lobbies where you're able to like move around and shoot people, but you're not in a game yet. And there could also be a debate that when you die, the time you spend spectating your team should count towards the waiting queue timer, but that's dumb and you should just be better and not die. If you were to play Counter-Strike for 40 hours, 2.5 hours of that time would be spent in a waiting queue. Now in that amount of time, you could have done something useful by sharpening around 393 pencils down to the eraser. Everyone here is a female. And I don't know how to talk to those creatures, so I'd rather play CS personally. But Valorant was actually a lot more fun than I remember. I haven't played Valorant in a while, and I was a pretty low level, so my queue times were honestly pretty short if I had to guess. I spent 8 minutes and 38 seconds out of like 116 minutes in a queue, which meant that 7.4% of my time playing the game was spent in a waiting queue. Dude, I honestly did not expect this. I figured Valorant would have one of the longest queue times. And maybe it is for people who don't touch grass, but results are results. So overall, if you played 40 hours of Valorant, nearly 3 hours of that time would be spent in a waiting queue. That means if you were like Joey Chestnut, you could eat nearly 1,500 glizzies in the time you waited for a game to load up.
What a save!
You know, one thing a lot of games have implemented to their waiting queues is a practice lobby where you can still move around and do stuff, kind of like CS like I mentioned before. It's a sneaky way to make sure people don't get disengaged and switch to a different game. Rocket League does this pretty well. The queues can be brutal, especially if you're trying to play like Chaos mode. If you know, you know. For the sake of this video, I only played 2v2s and 3v3s to make sure I got an accurate queue time because no one plays Chaos. I spent 13 minutes and 38 seconds out of roughly 2 hours in a waiting queue. If we take 1338 and divide it by my playtime, we get roughly 11.5%. 11.5% of my time playing Rocket League was spent in a waiting queue, which might not sound too bad, but if you put it into perspective, more than 1/10 of my time playing Rocket League was not spent playing Rocket League. So, if you played Rocket League for 40 hours, you would waste nearly 4.5 hours in a queue. In that time, you could have at least talked to like one woman, right? At least once.
You know what? He just left.
Dude, I have not gotten so frustrated at a game as I did while I was playing Smash Bros by myself.
What?
Dude, what do these people do all day? Like, I was getting slapped around by a piece of lettuce harder than Steve-O's friends walking into an office.
What's up, nerds?
Anyway, the audience for this game isn't dead, but I've never played a game where there was more than one other person in my match, which was kind of disappointing. It definitely made queue times a little lower, but still sad. Overall, I spent roughly 26 minutes out of like 134 minutes in a waiting queue. That meant 19.7% of my time playing Smash was wasted in a loading queue. If you played 40 hours of Smash Bros, you would waste nearly 8 hours waiting in a queue. In that amount of time, you might barely be able to renew your license at a DMV.
Can I please get a waffle?
League of Legends might have one of the most widespread results of queue times, depending on each individual. For the people who are sane and have never tried League, I'll try to give a little context for what I mean. League's champion select alone takes around 4 minutes to complete. If you want the real gritty details, it's 10 seconds to load in, 15 to hover a champion, 30 to ban champs, then 6 periods of 30 seconds to officially pick champs, with about 10 seconds of animation times in between. It's terrible. If someone leaves the champion select, the match is cancelled and you have to restart that whole process.
Nice.
This happens all the time in higher elos, and it's the most annoying thing in the world to me. But I didn't come here to complain. Also, I did count the time spent in champion select as part of the queue timer. You legitimately could make the argument that League's champ select is part of playing the game, as you plan and pick strategically when champs are picked, but I'm a low elo pig and I do what I want, so here are my times. I spent 24 minutes and 44 seconds out of 2 hours in a waiting queue. If you take my time in queue divided by roughly 2 hours, that gives us 20.4%. 20.4% of my time playing League was spent in a waiting queue. This had the potential to be extremely worse. Let's say I got dodged on 2 more times and add 10 minutes to my time, to like 34 minutes. That would change my percentage of time waiting to 28.7%, and that's literally awful. If you played 40 hours of League of Legends, you would waste anywhere from 8 hours to like 11.5 hours in a waiting queue, and possibly worse. In that time, you could have done anywhere from 49,000 to 69,000 jumping jacks. Honestly, I do believe League belongs in at least top 2, but low elo queues don't lie, so whatever, we're moving on. If you're bad at Fortnite, queue timers are a nightmare. Most every queue is about 1.5 minutes, which doesn't sound too bad, but if you die at every hot drop like me, you'll waste so much time.
That's bold.
I mean, I died within like 3 minutes of dropping out of the bus for my first 6 games, which is like, I don't know, like 15 minutes of wasted time. The simple truth is, the longer you survive, the more playtime you're awarded.
What the frick?
And I suck, so I got more queue time. Overall, I spent 26 minutes and 20 seconds out of the 2 hours I played in a waiting queue. That means 22.3% of my playtime was spent waiting. Again, if you played Fortnite for 40 hours, you would waste nearly 9 hours in a queue. You could have walked roughly 36 miles in that time. Okay, so there's 2 games left, and I don't know if anybody would have guessed that these 2 games would waste so much time. I certainly didn't. But if anybody was right this far, dude, hats off. I have no idea how you got that right. But for everybody else, take your final bet on which game wastes the most time, as the game that had the longest waiting queue times was Mario Kart. Now before examining Mario Kart and its numbers, let's get into Marvel Rivals first. I remember when I first started playing Marvel Rivals, I thought the queue times were like super quick. The second you'd click play, you'd be loading into a match. But after looking back, the typical process of getting into a game looks like this. You click play, find a game, load. Get the option to pick a champ, load. Watch a cutscene, load. Finally get into a map, but you're not able to leave spawn for 30 seconds. Yes, I'm adding that as queue time. On a side note, how have none of these games figured out that if you move the initial defender spawn to the point they're supposed to defend, you reduce that like 30 seconds of wait time? Wild. Win or lose, you'll be met with another cutscene and possibly another wait in spawn. Anyway, I spent 33 minutes out of like 2 hours waiting in some kind of a queue. Overall, that's 25% of my time spent playing in a queue. You know what's coming. If you played Marvel Rivals for 40 hours, you would waste nearly 10 hours in a queue. In that amount of time, you could have drank around 302 gallons of milk. Yo, I was shocked when I figured out these results. Not only did Mario Kart have the longest queue time, but nearly half of my playing time was spent in a waiting queue. I'll show the numbers in a second, but I will say that I enjoyed this game more than any of the other games I played. I didn't even mind the wait, it was just fun to drift around. But okay, 43 minutes and 53 seconds out of the 108 minutes I played were spent in a waiting queue. That means a whopping 40.6% of my time was spent in a waiting queue. This number is insane. Like, I actually can't believe that Mario Kart was the biggest time waster. I thought for sure it would have been League or maybe Fortnite. But regardless, if you spent 40 hours playing Mario Kart, you'd waste 16.5 hours in a waiting queue. In that time, you could have watched like all my other videos 12 times. So what are you waiting for, John? Just go do it. Personally, I think this one's pretty underrated. Now, we take all our time spent waiting in a queue, add them together, and divide them with our total time playing games to get our final percentage. Without further ado, our final numbers reveal that every time you play online games, you waste an average of 19.2% of your time in a waiting queue. That means you're wasting 1/5 of your time playing games by not playing games. Hopefully you guys enjoyed wasting time on this video. Remember, if you want to figure out your own time wasted, just take your time in queue, divide it by your time in game. Again, hopefully you enjoyed this. Good night, John.